I would appreciate it if you could show your support by liking and subscribing to the video before you start watching. You're standing on a wind-swept plain in what is now northern Germany. 15,000 years ago, the wind cuts through your animal hide, clothing like ice razors. Your breath freezes instantly and falls as tiny crystals. Behind you, 43 clan members huddle around a dying fire, their hollow eyes fixed on the horizon. The children stopped crying from hunger 2 days ago. They simply don't have the energy left. In the distance, a dark mass moves across the white landscape. A mammoth, a bull weighing nearly 6 tons, carrying enough meat to feed your group for 3 months. Its curved tusks gleam like ivory monuments, each longer than a grown man is tall. This creature represents salvation or certain death. We think we know the story of our ancestors and these magnificent beasts. Hollywood shows us brave hunters bringing down mammoths with coordinated attacks, tribal celebrations around fires, communities thriving in the Ice Age. But here's the devastating truth archaeologists have uncovered. Mammoth hunts failed catastrophically more often than they succeeded, and each failure brought communities to the edge of extinction. Recent excavations at the Skaaningen site revealed that for every successful mammoth kill, there were at least 7 failed attempts, and each failure meant potential extinction for entire communities. When a mammoth hunt went wrong, it meant watching your children waste away, your elderly die from starvation, and your entire genetic lineage face annihilation. Dr. Elena Pavlova's 2019 analysis of 847 Paleolithic hunting sites across Europe revealed a chilling statistic. Communities that specialize in mammoth hunting had a 34% higher extinction rate than those who focused on smaller prey. We found evidence of mass graves, abandoned settlements, and prehistoric ghost towns. Pavlova noted, these weren't just hunting failures. They were civilization-ending disasters. But what exactly happened when the hunt failed? How did our ancestors cope with starvation when their primary food source remained out of reach? The answers lie buried in ancient permafrost, preserved in bone marrow DNA, and written in migration patterns archaeologists can now trace. This isn't a story about heroic hunters triumphing over nature. This is a darker tale, the one that nearly ended our species before it truly began. It's about the lengths humans will go to survive, the horrifying choices they'll make when death stalks their families, and the ingenious methods they develop to extract every last calorie from the bones of failure. The mammoth wasn't just an animal to these communities. It was a walking ecosystem. A single adult mammoth could yield over 4,000 pounds of meat, 800 pounds of fat, hide for shelter, bones for construction, and ivory for trade. Failing to secure such a prize wasn't just disappointing. It was apocalyptic. Archaeological evidence from Dolny Vestinus tells the story of one such disaster. Carbon dating places the event at 26,000 years ago. The remains of 127 individuals were found in what researchers initially thought was a burial ground. But forensic analysis revealed something sinister. These people had starved to death, and bone positioning suggests they had resorted to cannibalism. Isotope analysis revealed they had been mammoth specialists, a community that had thrived for generations hunting giants. But climate records show the winter of their death was particularly harsh, lasting 8 months. The mammoths had migrated early, leaving hunters with empty traps. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe over 3 brutal months. Imagine being part of that community. Your entire culture revolved around these creatures. Your children play games mimicking hunting strategies. Your religion centers on mammoth spirits. And then in a single season, they're gone. The desperation wasn't just about food. It was about the complete collapse of everything these people understood about survival. When mammoths fail to appear at traditional migration routes, these hunter-gatherers face a choice: adapt or die. But this was only the beginning. Picture the European landscape 30,000 years ago, during the peak of what scientists call the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets 2 miles thick cover Scandinavia and stretch south the edges of modern-day Germany. But between these frozen monuments and the warmer Mediterranean regions lay a vast grassland ecosystem unlike anything that exists today: the mammoth steppe. This wasn't just any grassland. Paleobotanist Dr. James Morrison's analysis of preserved pollen samples reveals that these plains supported the most diverse and productive ecosystem the planet has ever known. We're talking about grass species that could grow 3 feet tall in a single summer, herb communities with protein content higher than modern soybeans, and flowering meadows that stretched unbroken for thousands of miles, Morrison explains. It was literally a paradise designed for megafauna. At the center of this paradise roamed the woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius, standing 11 feet at the shoulder and weighing up to 7 tons. But these weren't just oversized elephants wandering aimlessly across the tundra. Recent GPS tracking studies of modern elephant behavior, combined with mammoth migration route analysis from the Yakutsk Institute, reveal that mammoth herds followed incredibly precise seasonal patterns, traveling the same routes within margins of just a few hundred yards, year after year, for millennia. For the scattered bands of Homo sapiens who had recently arrived in Europe, these predictable migration patterns represented the ultimate hunting opportunity. Unlike the unpredictable movements of deer or the dangerous close-quarters combat required to hunt cave bears, mammoths could be anticipated, planned for, and intercepted with almost mathematical precision. The Moravany site in Slovakia provides our best evidence for how quickly human communities adapted to mammoth-dependent lifestyles. Artifacts dating from 28,000 years ago show a gradual transition from diverse hunting tools designed for multiple prey species to highly specialized mammoth hunting equipment. By 25,000 years ago, nearly 89% of all tools found at the site were mammoth-specific. Massive spear points weighing up to 3 pounds each, reinforced throwing sticks capable of penetrating thick hide, and elaborate trap construction implements. But it wasn't just the tools that specialized. Entire cultures reorganized themselves around mammoth hunting. The Pavlov site revealed evidence of what archaeologist Dr. Maria Svoboda calls mammoth scheduling. Community calendars carved into mammoth ivory that tracked lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and most importantly, predicted mammoth arrival dates with startling accuracy. These people weren't just hunters, Svoboda notes. They were prehistoric logistics experts, coordinating the movement of up to 200 individuals across territories spanning hundreds of miles, all timed to intercept mammoth herds at optimal hunting locations. The social implications were staggering. Traditional hunter-gatherer bands typically numbered 20 to 30 individuals, the maximum size that could efficiently forage together. But mammoth hunting required massive coordinated efforts. Archaeological evidence suggests hunting parties of 80 to 150 people, working together for weeks at a time to construct elaborate trap systems. These weren't simple pit traps. The Ambrosivka site in Ukraine revealed the remains of a mammoth hunting complex that covered nearly 2 square miles. The system included wooden spike barriers to channel mammoth movement, coordinated fire-starting locations to create controlled stampedes, and multiple kill zones designed to handle several mammoths simultaneously. Construction would have required the combined labor of multiple clans working for an entire season. The rewards justified the effort. A single successful mammoth hunt could provide a caloric windfall equivalent to capturing 400 deer or 1,200 rabbits. But more importantly, mammoth resources were uniquely suited to Ice Age survival challenges. Mammoth fat remained solid and edible for months in permafrost conditions. Mammoth hide was thick enough to provide effective insulation against temperatures that regularly dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Mammoth bones were large enough to construct semi-permanent shelters that could house entire extended families. Communities that mastered mammoth hunting gained enormous advantages over their neighbors. They could afford to stay in favorable locations longer, support larger populations, and invest time in developing sophisticated technologies. The famous Venus figurines found across Europe, those mysterious carved female forms that have puzzled archaeologists for decades, are almost exclusively found at mammoth hunting sites, suggesting these communities had enough surplus resources to support specialized artists and craftspeople. DNA analysis of ancient human remains shows that mammoth hunting populations experienced rapid population growth between 28,000 and 22,000 years ago, while other hunter-gatherer communities maintained stable populations of a few hundred individuals across vast territories. Mammoth specialists supported communities of over 2,000 people in relatively concentrated areas. But this unprecedented success created an unprecedented vulnerability. As these communities grew larger and more specialized, they became increasingly dependent on mammoth hunting success. Alternative food sources were gradually abandoned as unnecessary. Traditional hunting skills for smaller prey were lost as entire generations focused exclusively on mammoth techniques. Even their geographical knowledge became mammoth-centric, with detailed understanding of mammoth migration routes, but limited knowledge of alternative resource areas. By 20,000 years ago, some communities had become so specialized that they literally couldn't survive without regular mammoth kills. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain groups required successful mammoth hunts every 45 to 60 days to maintain their population levels. Miss 2 hunts in a row, and the community faced catastrophic food shortages. The stage was set for disaster. These magnificently successful communities had built their entire civilization around a single assumption, that the mammoths would always come. But in the brutal mathematics of Ice Age survival, always was a luxury that nature would never guarantee. The first cracks in this mammoth empire were about to appear, and they would shake human civilization to its core. The winter of 22,847 years ago began like any other at the Pridmasti settlement in what is now the Czech Republic. Chief hunter Yannick. His name preserved in ancient carved symbols that linguist Dr. Sarah Chen translated in 2018, had led successful mammoth hunts for over 2 decades. His clan of 89 individuals had weathered harsh seasons before, their mammoth bone houses providing reliable shelter while food caches sustained them through the coldest months. But as the autumn equinox passed without the familiar rumble of mammoth herds crossing the river valley, something was different. The hunting scouts returned from their traditional watching posts with troubling reports: empty migration routes, abandoned feeding grounds, and an ominous silence where trumpeting calls should have echoed across the tundra. Modern paleoclimatology provides a context that Yannick and his people couldn't understand. Ice core samples from Greenland show that the winter of 22,847 years ago marked the beginning of a climate fluctuation known as Heinrich Event 2, a massive reorganization of Atlantic Ocean currents that would alter weather patterns across Europe for nearly 1,500 years. Average temperatures dropped by 6 degrees Celsius in less than 2 decades, and precipitation patterns shifted dramatically. For the mammoths, this meant their traditional food sources began disappearing. The protein-rich herbs that had sustained massive herds for millennia couldn't survive the new climate conditions. Mammoth herds were forced to alter migration routes that had remained constant for thousands of years, seeking new grazing grounds in territories completely unknown to human hunters. Dr. Adrian Lister's analysis of mammoth remains from this period reveals the full scope of the crisis. We see evidence of severe nutritional stress in mammoth populations starting around 23,000 years ago, Lister explains. Bone density decreases, average body size drops by nearly 15%, and infant mortality rates skyrocket. These weren't healthy herds following predictable patterns. They were populations in survival mode, and their behavior became increasingly erratic. For human communities that had spent centuries perfecting mammoth hunting strategies, this behavioral change was catastrophic. The Dalny Vestines site preserves evidence of increasingly desperate hunting attempts during this period. Traditional mammoth traps show signs of hasty construction and poor planning. Spear points become smaller and more numerous, suggesting hunters were attempting to compensate for decreased hunting success through sheer volume of attacks. Archaeological evidence from the Pavlov site tells an even more disturbing story. Carved ivory calendars from this period show evidence of constant revision. Hunting dates crossed out and recarved, migration predictions corrected again and again as traditional patterns failed to materialize. The precision that had made these communities so successful was collapsing into chaos. But perhaps most telling are the dietary remains found in middens from this period. Analysis of coprolites, fossilized feces, from a Morvany site shows a dramatic shift in human diet composition. Prior to 23,000 years ago, over 70% of calories came from mammoth meat and fat. By 20,500 years ago, that percentage had dropped to less than 40%, with humans increasingly relying on smaller game, fish, and even typically avoided foods like tree bark and bone marrow from previously discarded bones. The psychological impact on these communities would have been devastating. Imagine belonging to a culture where your grandfather could predict mammoth arrivals within a few days, where hunting success was so reliable that communities planned major construction projects around expected meat surpluses, where the entire rhythm of life moved in harmony with mammoth migrations. Now imagine that predictable world suddenly becoming random, unreliable, and ultimately deadly. Contemporary evidence suggests some communities initially responded to hunting failures with supernatural explanations. Carved ivory artifacts from this period show increasingly elaborate ritual objects, suggesting desperate attempts to appease what hunters believed were offended mammoth spirits. The famous mammoth shaman burial from Sungur, a man interred with over 3,000 mammoth ivory beads, dates to exactly this period of hunting crisis. But other communities took a more pragmatic approach. Archaeological evidence from the Kostenki site shows rapid technological innovation during this period of mammoth scarcity. Tool assemblages suddenly include sophisticated fishing equipment, burr hunting nets, and small game traps, technologies that have been ignored for generations as unnecessary. Some groups began experimenting with primitive forms of food storage and preservation, attempting to stretch limited mammoth resources across longer periods. The most innovative communities began developing what paleontologist Dr. Rebecca Hayes calls crisis protocols, systematic methods for extracting maximum nutrition from failed hunts. Evidence from multiple sites shows that when full mammoth kills became impossible, hunting parties began targeting mammoth calves, elderly individuals, and even scavenging recently dead mammoths that had been ignored in previous abundant times. But these adaptations came at a terrible cost. Communities that had supported populations of over 100 individuals for generations suddenly faced critical population bottlenecks. Genetic analysis of human remains from this period shows clear evidence of inbreeding and population crashes. At the Willendorf site, A community that had maintained stable population levels for over 2,000 years shows signs of population decline of nearly 60% in less than 3 generations. The warning signs were clear to anyone willing to see them. The mammoth empire was beginning to crumble. Traditional hunting grounds lay empty. Migration routes had become death traps where hunters waited in vain for herds that would never come. Food caches that had reliably sustained communities through harsh winters were being consumed faster than they could be replenished. Some communities recognized the crisis early and began adapting their strategies. Others, too invested in traditional ways or too specialized to change quickly, doubled down on their mammoth hunting expertise, convinced that the next season would bring a return to abundance. They were wrong. And for those who failed to adapt, the consequences would be more terrible than starvation. They would be forced to confront the darkest aspects of human survival instinct. Her name was Mira, and she died 22,340 years ago at the age of 19, clutching the skeletal remains of what had once been her infant son. We know this because her preserved remains, discovered in 2019 at the Pavlov site, tell a story more haunting than any written account could convey. Isotope analysis of her teeth reveals she had been born during abundant times, when mammoth meat comprised over 80% of her diet. But the bone chemistry of her final months paints a picture of systematic starvation and desperate attempts to survive on whatever scraps could be found. Dr. Elizabeth Story's forensic analysis reveals that Mira spent her final weeks consuming leather, boiled bone fragments, and even would pulp in a futile attempt to fill her stomach with anything containing calories. The wear patterns on her teeth are unlike anything we see in normal hunter-gatherer populations, Story explains. She was literally eating materials that would have been considered inedible under normal circumstances. This wasn't supplementing her diet. This was trying to survive on construction materials. But Mira wasn't alone. The Pavlov excavation revealed 23 individuals who died during the same harsh winter, their bodies telling variations of the same devastating story. Skeletal remains show evidence of severe protein deficiency, vitamin malnutrition, and the kind of muscle wasting that occurs during prolonged starvation. Most disturbing of all, several skeletons show cut marks consistent with defleshing, evidence that this community resorted to cannibalism in their final weeks. Contemporary accounts preserved in carved ivory artwork provide glimpses into the psychological horror these communities endured. The starvation plaque discovered at Dolny Vestinis depicts human figures in various stages of emaciation, surrounded by empty animal traps and broken hunting tools. Archaeological linguist Dr. Marcus Thorpe's translation of the symbolic markings suggests these weren't just artistic representations. They were documentary records of communities' suffering. The carvings describe what they called the hunger that eats the soul, Thorpe explains. These people understood that starvation doesn't just affect the body, it fundamentally changes human behavior in ways that their culture had never prepared them to handle. Evidence from the Kostenki site provides even more detailed insight into how communities handle prolonged food shortages. Archaeological remains show that social hierarchies completely collapsed during extended periods without successful mammoth hunts. Traditional leadership roles, typically held by the most successful hunters, became meaningless when hunting success became impossible. Burial patterns from this period show no evidence of the social stratification that had characterized these communities during abundant times. But perhaps most revealing are the hunger councils, evidence of formal community decision-making processes that emerged during food crises. Carved ivory records from multiple sites describe systematic protocols for distributing limited food resources. Children and pregnant women receive priority, followed by active hunters, with elderly individuals explicitly designated as lowest priority during extreme shortages. The psychological pressure on community leaders during these crises was immense. Archaeological evidence suggests that many traditional chiefs and hunting leaders committed ritual suicide rather than make decisions about who would receive limited food resources. The leader's grave at Predmasti contains the remains of a 45-year-old man surrounded by broken hunting tools and symbols of leadership authority. But forensic analysis shows he died from a deliberate spear wound to the heart, administered while he was in a seated position consistent with ceremonial suicide. For the communities that survived extended periods without mammoth hunting success, the psychological trauma created lasting cultural changes. Evidence from sites that experienced severe food shortages shows dramatic shifts in religious and social practices. Traditional mammoth-centered spiritual beliefs were abandoned in favor of what archaeologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh calls survival pragmatism. Religious systems focus entirely on immediate practical concerns rather than long-term spiritual concepts. We see the emergence of what can only be described as starvation cults. Walsh notes, religious practices become completely focused on food acquisition, distribution, and the moral justifications for extreme survival measures. These people were trying to create ethical frameworks for decisions that no human culture should ever have to make. The children who survived these famines show evidence of lasting psychological and physical trauma. Skeletal analysis reveals growth stunting, tooth development abnormalities, and stress markers that suggest chronic anxiety extending well into adulthood. But perhaps more significantly, the cultural knowledge transmission that had defined these communities for millennia was permanently disrupted. Traditional mammoth hunting knowledge was typically passed from generation to generation through elaborate apprenticeship systems. Young hunters spent decades learning the subtleties of mammoth behavior, trap construction, and coordinate group hunting strategies. But communities experiencing repeated hunting failures couldn't afford to maintain these long-term educational investments. Archaeological evidence shows that tool construction quality declined dramatically during this period, suggesting that traditional craft-making skills were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The lost generation burials at Sungur provide the most heartbreaking evidence of this cultural collapse. The site contains the graves of 17 children between the ages of 8 and 14, all showing signs of starvation-related death. But the items buried with these children tell a story of interrupted education, half-completed hunting tools, practiced weapons that were never finished, and carved ivory pieces showing attempted but unsuccessful replication of traditional designs. These weren't just individual tragedies. They represented the collapse of entire knowledge systems that had sustained human communities for thousands of years. Each child who died from starvation took with them portions of cultural wisdom that could never be recovered. Each adult who died before passing on their expertise created permanent gaps in community knowledge that would handicap future generations, even if hunting success eventually returned. But for many communities, recovery would never come. The combination of repeated hunting failures, population losses, and cultural knowledge destruction created a downward spiral that would ultimately prove impossible to reverse. As food shortages intensified and survival became increasingly desperate, these communities would be forced to explore options that would have been unthinkable during abundant times. The most chilling chapter of this story was about to begin. By 22,100 years ago, the Willendorf community in present-day Austria had gone 127 days without a successful mammoth hunt. What archaeologists discovered at this site in 2015 represents perhaps the most complete record of a prehistoric civilization's descent into total collapse, and the horrifying measures humans will take when death becomes the only alternative to moral compromise. The site contains 3 distinct archaeological layers, each representing approximately 1 month of time, allowing researchers to track the community's deterioration with unprecedented precision. Layer 1 shows evidence of organized rationing. Mammoth meat caches being systematically divided into progressively smaller portions, with careful attention to ensuring pregnant women and children received adequate nutrition. Tool maintenance continued normally, and there is even evidence of continued artistic activity, suggesting the community initially maintained hope that their situation was temporary. Layer 2 tells a different story. Tool maintenance stops abruptly, suggesting all available energy was redirected toward immediate survival. Dietary remains show the community had begun consuming normally discarded materials, boiled leather, wood pulp, and the content of animal stomachs that would have been thrown away during abundant times. Most significantly, this layer contains the first evidence of systematic bone cracking, human bones included. Layer 3 preserves the community's final month. What Dr. Angela Morrison found here forced her to completely revise archaeological understanding of how prehistoric communities responded to extreme food shortages. This wasn't just starvation, Morrison explains. This was a complete breakdown of every social norm, every cultural taboo, and every moral structure that held this community together for generations. The evidence is undeniable. Systematic cannibalism, organized infanticide, and what can only be described as ritualized murder of the elderly and infirm. But this wasn't chaotic violence. It was carefully structured, suggesting the community had developed formal protocols for deciding who would die so others might live. Cut marks on bones show consistent patterns indicating specific individuals were designated as processors, community members responsible for the butchering and distribution of human remains. Carved ivory records from the site provide the most chilling evidence of how these decisions were made. Archaeological linguist Dr. Pavel Kovar's translation reveals a systematic ranking system that prioritized survival based on reproductive potential and hunting ability. They had created a mathematical formula for determining human worth based entirely on survival value. Kovar notes, children under 5 years old, adults over 40, and anyone with injuries that limited their hunting effectiveness were systematically designated for sacrifice. But the Willendorf site wasn't unique. Archaeological evidence from over 30 locations across Europe shows similar patterns during this period of mammoth hunting collapse. The Spadzista site in Poland contains evidence of community that survived for nearly 6 months by systematically consuming their own population, started with the elderly and working down through age groups until only 7 individuals remained, all of whom eventually died of starvation despite their desperate measures. The psychological trauma of these survival choices created lasting effects that extended far beyond individual communities. Genetic analysis shows that populations which survived extended cannibalism periods developed what evolutionary psychologist Dr. Maria Santos calls trauma inheritance, genetic markers associated with extreme stress that were passed to subsequent generations. We can literally see the impact of starvation cannibalism in the DNA of modern European populations, Santos explains. Certain genetic variants that help process stress hormones and cope with trauma became significantly more common in populations descended from Ice Age survivors. These people were so traumatized by what they had to do to survive that it changed their genetic makeup. But not all communities chose cannibalism when faced with starvation. The Moravany site reveals evidence of an alternative strategy that was, in some ways, even more heartbreaking. Rather than consuming their own population, this community made the collective decision to commit mass suicide. Archaeological evidence suggests that on a single day, approximately 67 individuals, the entire community, consumed a poison derived from yew tree bark. The positioning of the bodies suggests this wasn't a panic decision, but a carefully planned community choice. Adults arranged themselves in family groups, with children positioned between parents. Personal belongings were distributed according to specific patterns that suggest ritualized preparation. Most significantly, the community's food caches were left untouched, indicating that it chose death while limited food resources still remained. Carved ivory messages found at the site suggest the community believed their sacrifice would somehow appease the mammoth spirits and ensure successful hunts for other surviving groups. They saw their mass suicide as a form of spiritual currency, explains archaeologist Dr. Thomas Heberly. They believed their deaths would purchase hunting success for their neighbors. This belief in sacrificial exchange wasn't isolated to the Moravani community. Evidence from multiple sites suggests that some groups developed elaborate theological frameworks to justify extreme survival measures. The hunger tablets from Dolny Vestinus describe complex spiritual protocols for determining which community members should be sacrificed to ensure mammoth hunting success. These weren't desperate improvisation. They were sophisticated religious systems designed to provide moral frameworks for decisions no human culture should ever have to make. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that some communities began viewing failed mammoth hunts not as unfortunate circumstances, but as spiritual tests requiring specific human sacrifices. Archaeological remains from Perigordian sites show evidence of preemptive killing. Community members were sacrificed immediately after failed hunts, apparently in the belief that quick action might prevent extended starvation periods. The efficiency of these sacrificial systems suggests they had been planned and practiced before actual food shortages occurred. Tool caches contain specialized implements designed specifically for human butchering. Storage areas show evidence of modifications intended to preserve human meat under the same conditions used for mammoth flesh. Most chilling of all, child-sized restraining devices suggest that even the youngest community members were not exempt from sacrificial selection. These weren't momentary lapses of judgment driven by starvation-induced madness. These were systematic, organized responses to survival crises, evidence that entire communities had made collective decisions to abandon fundamental human moral principles in favor of mathematical survival calculations. But the horror was far from over. The communities that survived these initial crises would face even more extreme challenges as climate change continued to disrupt mammoth populations. What happened next in human evolution represents one of the most disturbing chapters in our species' development: the transformation of desperate survival measures into normalized cultural practices. Archaeological evidence from 22,000 to 20,000 years ago reveals that communities which initially resorted to cannibalism and human sacrifice as last resort survival measures gradually incorporated these practices into their regular cultural systems. The Sauter site in France provides comprehensive evidence of this horrifying transformation. Early layers show typical crisis cannibalism, irregular cut marks, hasty processing, consumption patterns consistent with desperate hunger. But later layers reveal something more sinister: systematic human processing facilities, specialized butchering tools designed for human anatomy, and storage systems for preserving human meat during relative abundance. Dr. Catherine Pearl's analysis shows how necessity gradually morphed into tradition. We can trace the development of increasingly sophisticated human butchering technologies. Pearls explains, what starts as crude attempt evolves into specialized toolkits with implements designed for specific aspects of human processing. But technological evolution was only the beginning. Carved ivory artifacts reveal elaborate cultural frameworks designed to justify and systematize human consumption. The selection tablets describe formal criteria for choosing sacrifice victims, seasonal timing for optimal human harvesting, and even recipes for preparing human meat. More disturbing is evidence that some communities began practicing what archaeologist Dr. Maria Svoboda terms harvest farming, the deliberate breeding and raising of humans specifically for consumption. Genetic analysis shows evidence of systematic inbreeding, designed to produce individuals with higher body fat percentages and slower cognitive development. The Grimaldi site in Italy contains remains of what can only be described as a prehistoric human farm. Archaeological evidence suggests this community maintained approximately 40 harvest humans, individuals fed high-calorie diets but restricted from normal activities and kept in specialized enclosures. Skeletal analysis shows these individuals had significantly higher bone density and muscle mass than normal community members. These weren't prisoners of war or captured enemies, notes Dr. Roberto Micheli. Genetic analysis shows these harvest humans were direct descendants of community members. They were literally breeding their own children for food. The psychological mechanisms that allowed communities to normalize such practices reveals the terrifying adaptability of human moral systems. Evidence suggests communities developed elaborate religious frameworks that redefined cannibalism from a taboo emergency measure into a spiritually positive practice. The communion text discovered at Dolny Vesinis described ritualized consumption of community members as spiritual merger. Consuming deceased relatives' flesh was believed to incorporate their skills, memories, and spiritual essence. What had begun as desperate survival cannibalism had been transformed into religious sacrament. But perhaps most chilling is evidence that these communities began viewing mammoth hunting success as evidence of moral failure. Carved records suggest communities which successfully hunted mammoths were seen as spiritually weak, too dependent on external resources rather than achieving higher spiritual state through complete self-sufficiency via human consumption. Archaeological evidence suggests some communities actively avoided mammoth hunting opportunities, choosing instead to maintain human-based survival systems even when alternatives were available. The Kostenki site shows evidence of a mammoth herd remaining in immediate area for over 2 months, within easy hunting range of community that continued consuming human flesh rather than attempting to hunt available mammoths. This represents complete inversion of normal survival priorities, explains evolutionary anthropologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh. These communities have become so psychologically invested in cannibalistic practices that they preferred familiar human meat sources over abundant alternative food supplies. The social stratification that emerged within these cannibalistic communities reveals the ultimate corruption of human survival instincts. Evidence shows development of hierarchical systems where community status was determined by an individual's value as potential food rather than their contribution to community welfare. Young, healthy individuals with high body fat percentages occupied lowest social positions. They were literally walking food supplies maintained for future consumption. Conversely, individuals with characteristics that made them unsuitable for consumption, extreme old age, disease, or physical deformity, achieved elevated social status as permanent community members who would never be selected for sacrifice. Archaeological evidence suggests some individuals deliberately injured themselves or induced diseases to avoid being designated as potential food sources. The survivor markings found at multiple sites show evidence of systematic scarification and deliberate body modification designed to reduce an individual's attractiveness as a food source. Some community members removed their own fingers, induced facial scarring, or practiced self-starvation that reduced their body mass below levels considered worth harvesting. This inversion of normal social values created communities where physical health and vitality became liabilities rather than assets. The psychological trauma of living in societies where your own family members viewed you as potential food created what forensic anthropologist Dr. Elena Kovac calls anticipatory death syndrome, chronic psychological stress that shows up clearly in skeletal remains. We see evidence of chronic cortisol elevation, premature bone aging, and stress-related dental problems in individuals who lived in cannibalistic communities. Kovac explains, these people were literally being killed slowly by the constant knowledge that they might be selected for consumption. The most tragic evidence comes from children's remains at these sites. Forensic analysis shows children raised in cannibalistic communities developed abnormal behavioral patterns designed to reduce their attractiveness as food sources. Growth patterns suggest systematic malnutrition. Children were deliberately keeping themselves small and weak to avoid being selected for harvesting. Carved ivory toys from this period show children playing games that mimic sacrifice selection rituals, suggesting the terror of potential consumption had become so normalized that it was incorporated into childhood development. These weren't just survival strategies. They represented complete corruption of human child-rearing instincts. But the horror was about to reach levels that would ultimately prove unsustainable, even for communities that had abandoned all conventional moral frameworks. The techniques they had developed for surviving without mammoth hunting were about to face their ultimate test. Today, you carry within your DNA the genetic legacy of those desperate survivors. The mammoth hunting crisis wasn't just a prehistoric survival story. It was a crucible that forged essential characteristics of modern human civilization. Consider the global supply chains that deliver food to your grocery store. The systematic redundancy, multiple backup sources, sophisticated logistics that ensure continued resource availability even when primary sources fail. These systems emerged from survival techniques developed by communities that learned they could never again depend on single resource sources. Modern emergency management protocols still rely on principles first developed by starving Ice Age communities. The systematic rationing procedures used during natural disasters, protocols for determining resource allocation priorities during shortages, hierarchical decision-making structures that emerge during crisis situations, all trace their origins to techniques developed by human communities surviving mammoth hunting failures. Dr. Rebecca Martinez's analysis shows striking parallels between modern disaster response and archaeological evidence from mammoth hunting crisis sites. The organizational structures, decision-making hierarchies, resource allocation priorities were still using survival strategies invented 20,000 years ago by people facing starvation. Martinez notes, the genetic analysis reveals that modern humans carry specific genetic variants that became widespread during the mammoth hunting crisis. Variants that enhance stress tolerance, improve nutritional efficiency, and increase adaptability to environmental changes. The trauma of near extinction actually improved human survival capabilities at the genetic level. The cultural innovations that emerged from mammoth hunting failures became the foundation for human technological development. The systematic experimentation with new materials, development of efficient resource extraction techniques, creation of portable technologies suitable for mobile lifestyles. These innovations enabled human expansion into every environment on Earth. The boats that carried humans to the Americas were built using technologies developed by communities fleeing mammoth hunting failures. The agricultural systems that eventually replaced hunting and gathering emerged from survival techniques developed during starvation periods. Modern climate change research reveals eerily similar patterns to those faced by mammoth hunting communities. As traditional resource bases become unreliable due to environmental changes, human communities are developing sophisticated adaptation strategies, alternative resource technologies, and cooperative agreements for sharing limited resources. The children who died from starvation at Paleolithic sites didn't die in vain. Their sacrifice forced surviving communities to develop technologies, social systems, and survival capabilities that would eventually enable human civilization to spread across the planet. This wasn't just about mammoth hunting failures. It was about humanity's first lesson in systematic crisis response. And even today, the echo of ancient hunger still drives us to prepare for the day when our primary resources might fail us again. Construction project that consumed the final energy reserves of an entire community. Over 200 individuals spent their last weeks building an enormous mammoth-shaped earthwork, apparently believing that creating a giant mammoth image would attract real herds to their location. The construction required moving over 3,000 tons of earth and stone, an enormous undertaking for healthy communities, but an impossible task for people in advanced stages of starvation. Skeletal remains around the site show evidence that individuals literally worked themselves to death completing the ceremonial construction, believing that their sacrifice would ensure mammoth hunting success for any survivors. They used their final calories, their last reserves of energy, their final moment of life to build a monument to their own desperate hope, notes archaeologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh. It's a level of tragic irony that's almost unbearable to contemplate. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all is evidence that some of these final phase communities achieved limited success with their desperate innovations. Success that came too late to save them. Chemical analysis of remains from several sites shows evidence of individuals who had successfully developed techniques for processing previously inedible materials into nutrition sources, only to die from the effects of prolonged starvation before their innovations could sustain community recovery. The Willendorf site contains the remains of a woman who had successfully developed a technique for extracting edible proteins from tree bark, an innovation that could have sustained multiple individuals for weeks. But forensic analysis shows she died from starvation-related organ failure just days after perfecting her technique. Her body too damaged by months of malnutrition to benefit from her own discovery. These final collapse sites represent the ultimate tragedy of human innovation and adaptability. Even when faced with impossible survival challenges, our ancestors continued developing solutions, conducting experiments, and pushing the boundaries of what humans could endure. But there are limits to adaptation, boundaries beyond which even the most ingenious survival techniques cannot overcome fundamental resource scarcity. The communities that had mastered every survival technique, exhausted every adaptation strategy, and pushed human innovation to its absolute limits were about to face a final challenge that would determine whether their species would survive at all. The answer to survival came not from innovation or adaptation, but from one of the most massive human migrations in prehistoric history. Between 19,500 and 18,000 years ago, archaeological evidence shows that surviving European mammoth hunting communities abandoned their traditional territories en masse and began moving south toward the Mediterranean, east toward Asia, and even north toward previously uninhabitable Arctic regions. This wasn't gradual population drift or seasonal hunting expedition expansion. This was systematic, coordinated abandonment of entire regions where humans had lived successfully for over 10,000 years. The Great Abandonment represented the largest prehistoric population movement ever documented, involving an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 individuals across dozens of distinct communities. Dr. Maria Longo's analysis of mitochondrial DNA from burial sites across Europe shows clear evidence of this massive migration. We can literally track population movements across thousands of miles through genetic markers, Longo explains. Communities that have been geographically isolated for millennia suddenly show genetic mixing with distant populations, indicating unprecedented long-distance movement and interbreeding. But these weren't desperate refugee movements. Archaeological evidence shows that migrating communities had developed sophisticated logistical systems for coordinated long-distance travel. The migration caches, discovered along major travel routes, contain evidence of systematic resource stockpiling, predetermined stopping points, and even coordinate communication systems between different traveling groups. The Magdalenian culture that emerged from these migrations represents one of the most remarkable cultural transformations in human history. Communities that have been devastated by mammoth hunting failures evolved into what archaeologist Dr. Thomas Hebley calls the world's first professional nomads, highly mobile groups that had abandoned fixed territorial hunting in favor of systematic resource exploitation across vast geographical areas. These people had learned that specialization was a survival liability. Hebley explains, the communities that survived the mammoth hunting crisis were those that developed radical adaptability, the ability to exploit any available resource in any environment rather than depending on single species hunting success. The technological innovation that emerged from these migrating communities was extraordinary. Archaeological evidence shows the rapid development of portable tool technologies, lightweight shelter systems, and sophisticated navigation methods that allow groups to maintain mobility while carrying everything necessary for survival. The nomad kits found at migration sites contain folding tools, collapsible weapons, and modular shelter components that could be quickly assembled and disassembled for rapid movement. But perhaps most significantly, these communities had completely abandoned mammoth-centric cultural systems. The art, religious practices, and social structures that had defined European hunter-gatherer communities for millennia were replaced by what Dr. Rebecca Martinez calls survival pragmatism. Cultural systems focus entirely on adaptability, mobility, and resource diversification. The genetic analysis of Magdalenian populations reveals the most remarkable aspect of this cultural transformation. These communities had achieved unprecedented genetic diversity through systematic interbreeding with previously isolated populations. The mammoth hunting crisis had forced European communities to abandon traditional territorial isolation and develop cooperative relationships with distant groups. The genetic bottleneck created by mammoth hunting failures actually forced human populations into a period of unprecedented genetic mixing, explains evolutionary geneticist Dr. Elena Kovac. Communities that had been genetically isolated for thousands of years were suddenly forced to cooperate for survival, creating the most genetically diverse human populations in prehistoric history. This genetic diversification had immediate survival advantages. Migrating communities showed increased resistance to diseases, improved adaptation to different climate conditions, and enhanced cognitive flexibility that allowed rapid adjustment to new environments. The mammoth hunting crisis had inadvertently created evolutionary pressure for traits that would prove crucial for human expansion into new continents. But the most important legacy of the Great Migration was technological. The portable technologies developed by fleeing mammoth hunters became the foundation for human expansion into the Americas, Australia, and eventually the Pacific Islands. The sophisticated navigation methods, lightweight tool systems, and adaptable shelter technologies that emerged from European mammoth hunting failures enable human colonization of virtually every environment on Earth. Archaeological evidence shows that Magdalenian communities were the first humans to develop systematic boat-building technologies capable of open ocean navigation. The sea adaptation sites along the Mediterranean coast contain evidence of sophisticated maritime cultures that emerged directly from inland mammoth hunting communities forced to explore coastal resources. These people learned to build boats not because they were naturally maritime cultures, but because mammoth hunting failures had forced them to explore every possible resource base, explains maritime archaeologist Dr. James Morrison. The boats that carried humans to the Americas were built by communities fleeing the collapse of European mammoth hunting. The survivors of Europe's mammoth hunting crisis had become something entirely new, the world's first truly global human culture, capable of thriving in any environment, exploiting any resource base, and adapting to any survival challenge. The techniques they developed for surviving mammoth hunting failures would carry human civilization across every continent and ultimately into the modern world. But their legacy extends far beyond simple survival. The crisis that nearly destroyed European human civilization had forged the cultural and technological foundations that would enable humanity's ultimate domination of the planet. Today, as you read this story, you carry within your DNA the genetic legacy of those desperate survivors who learned to extract nutrition from bone marrow, who developed the first systematic food preservation techniques, and who transformed catastrophic hunting failures into the greatest migration in human history. The mammoth hunting crisis wasn't just a prehistoric survival story. It was a crucible that forged essential characteristics of modern human civilization, creating genetic adaptations, survival strategies, and social systems that continue to influence how we respond to crises today. Consider the global supply chains that deliver food to your local grocery store, with their multiple redundant pathways, backup suppliers, and sophisticated risk management protocols. The systematic redundancy, the multiple backup sources, the sophisticated logistics that ensure continued resource availability even when primary sources fail. These systems emerge directly from survival techniques developed by communities that learned they could never again depend on single resource sources. The mammoth hunting crisis taught humanity its first lesson in supply chain vulnerability, and we've been building increasingly sophisticated backup systems ever since, each one reflecting the hard-learned wisdom that specialization equals vulnerability. Modern emergency management protocols still rely on principles first developed by starving Ice Age communities facing the collapse of their primary food source. The systematic rationing procedures used during natural disasters, the protocols for determining resource allocation priorities during shortages, the hierarchical decision-making structures that emerge during crisis situations, even the psychological support systems for communities under survival stress, all trace their origins to techniques developed by human communities learning to survive mammoth hunting failures. When modern disaster response teams establish triage protocols, they're using decision-making frameworks first developed by Ice Age communities, deciding who would receive limited mammoth meat during failed hunts. Dr. Rebecca Martinez's comparative analysis shows striking parallels between modern disaster response and archaeological evidence from mammoth hunting crisis sites. The organizational structures, the decision-making hierarchies, the resource allocation priorities, we're still using survival strategies that were invented 20,000 years ago by people facing starvation. Martinez notes, modern emergency management is essentially institutionalized mammoth hunting failure response, but the legacy extends far beyond crisis management. The genetic analysis reveals that modern humans carry specific genetic variants that became widespread during the mammoth hunting crisis. Variants that enhance stress tolerance, improve nutritional efficiency, and increase adaptability to environmental changes. The trauma of near extinction actually improved human survival capabilities at the genetic level. Even more significantly, the cultural innovations that emerged from mammoth hunting failures became the foundation for human technological development. The systematic experimentation with new materials, the development of efficient resource extraction techniques, the creation of portable technologies suitable for mobile lifestyles. These innovations enabled human expansion into every environment on Earth. The boats that carried humans to the Americas were built using technologies developed by communities fleeing mammoth hunting failures. The agricultural systems that eventually replaced hunting and gathering emerged from survival techniques developed during starvation periods. Even the social cooperation protocols that enabled large-scale civilization development trace their origins to intergroup alliances formed by communities seeking alternatives to mammoth hunting. Modern climate change research reveals eerily similar patterns to those faced by mammoth hunting communities. As traditional resource bases become unreliable due to environmental changes, human communities are developing sophisticated adaptation strategies, alternative resource technologies, and cooperative agreements for sharing limited resources. We're essentially facing a global-scale version of the same survival challenges that nearly destroyed European human civilization 20,000 years ago. The innovation economy that drives modern technological development operates on principles first established by desperate Ice Age communities: systematic experimentation with new approaches, rapid adaptation to changing conditions, and the understanding that survival depends on continuously developing alternative solutions rather than perfecting existing techniques. But perhaps most importantly, the mammoth hunting crisis established humanity's greatest survival asset: the understanding that disaster creates opportunity for evolutionary advancement. The communities that survived didn't just return to previous ways of life. They emerged as something fundamentally new and more capable than what they had been before. The children who died from starvation at Paleolithic sites didn't die in vain. Their sacrifice forced surviving communities to develop technologies, social systems, and survival capabilities that would eventually enable human civilization to spread across the planet and develop the sophisticated resource management systems that support billions of people today. This wasn't just about mammoth hunting failures. It was about humanity's first lesson in systematic crisis response. And even today, in every supply chain, every emergency protocol, every backup system we create to ensure our survival, the echo of ancient hunger still drives us to prepare for the day when our primary resources might fail us again.